Good morning. It's great to be back here with my One World family and our friends in Zoomland. I always enjoy the One World gatherings, whatever our format, and it has been especially fun lately since we are meeting so many more new people from around the world. I appreciate being here, and I'm happy for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. Today's talk is about the relationship between ego and gratitude. I've been thinking about this topic for a few weeks, and since our theme for this month is all about gratitude, it was easy to imagine a discussion that put these two seemingly opposite states of being in the same conversation. But when it came time to actually put my thoughts in order, I realized three important things. First, even though the last couple of talks I presented touched on how the ego influences our lives, I realized I really did not know a whole lot about what the ego is. Second, I became aware that I was not sure how I felt about the concept of gratitude, or even if I truly know what it means to be grateful. And third, I had a lot of reading and preparing to do. Gratitude is an important and in today's world, an especially timely topic that is discussed quite frequently, not only at One World, but also by spiritual teachers everywhere. So where else should I start but by reviewing our own Reverend Melanie's talk last Sunday, in which she discussed how the energy of gratitude reflects the truth of our being and gives us a way of seeing all the world as holy. I also went a couple of weeks back to listen to Asha's delightful talk about befriending darkness, especially when she referred to Jung's theory that our shadow represents a moral problem that challenges the ego personality. According to this concept, it takes considerable effort to become conscious of the shadow, accept our darker aspects of personality as present and real, and then integrate them into a whole unified and enlightened being. And sometimes we're working against the ego to be able to find that shadow and then investigate it and finally to overcome or to integrate it into our ego personality. And by the way, if you missed these talks, they are available through our One World website, and they are well worth the time it takes to listen. Finally, I did a great deal of reading, and today I want to share with you my thoughts about ego and gratitude and whether these two states of being are compatible or if they are completely contradictory. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or a therapist. However, my opinion is that the ego part of us and the spiritual part of us are not exclusive or opposed to one another. After all, if we ascribe to the belief that all humans are created in the divine image, then we must also accept that all parts of us, and that would include our ego, are created divinely. They're created equally and with noble purpose, because God cannot create anything that is not good or that is designed to be harmful to us, which made me wonder why ego gets such a bad rap so much of the time, not only in everyday conversation, but also in popular culture, as well as academic discourse, political commentary, and the writings and teachings of many popular spiritual pundits. So I went looking for information that would either tell me I was completely off track or whether there might be some validity to my idea that ego, which is primarily concerned with the outer self, is not all bad and that it can coexist with gratitude, a quality associated with the inner self. Now, I realize I'm venturing into very deep waters here, making my way around at the speed of a dog paddle rather than a deep dive. And because I am not a professional when it comes to either gratitude or the ego, Most of what I will most of what I will relate to you this morning is based on what I found in my own reading. But it is what makes sense to me, and I offer it only as my perspective, not professional opinion, with the hope that it might get you to think about your own understanding of ego, gratitude, and the relationship between the two. As usual, I want to start off by offering my working definition of the main subjects, and I'll start with ego. Mark Leary, a professor of psychology and neuroscience, states that the concept of ego is among the most confusing in psychology. According to Leary, put simply, the English word ego is the Latin word for I. So literally translated, ego means I. The use of the term ego crept into psychology as the part of the personality that arbitrates between the animalistic desires of the id and the moral and social standards of the superego. Interestingly, the word ego does not even appear anywhere in Freud's writings. He never used it. Rather, ego was translation of what Freud, writing in German, called das Ich, literally the I. In essence, Freud was referring to that conscious, decision-making thought form we regard as I, as when we say, I dislike my teacher, or I decided to change jobs, or I really hope you enjoyed this talk this morning. These three personality elements, the id, the ego, and the superego, are further defined by mind development researcher and teacher Gregory Mitchell as follows. The id is the part of the psyche that is totally unconscious and serves as the source of intellectual impulses and demands for immediate satisfaction of primitive needs. Such desires seek satisfaction in accordance with the pleasure principle and are modified by the ego and the superego before they are given overt expression. It is my observation that when attributing negative actions and feelings to the ego, a lot of people are actually describing the demands and immature expression of the id. The ego is that part of the personality which is experienced as being oneself, our image, that which we recognize as I, me, mine. Ego is our face to the world. Superego is that part of the personality which influences self-observation, self-criticism, and other moral and reflective activities. Professor Elizabeth Lundbeck of Harvard describes these three personality traits with a touch of humor. She suggests that if we type the string of words id, ego, superego into a Google search box, we might get images of The Simpsons. Homer Simpson to represent the id, as he is motivated by pleasure and characterized by unbridled desire. Marge stands for the ego, controlled and bound to reality. And Lisa embodies the superego, the family's stubborn and obstinate conscience. Lundbeck goes on to say that if we add politics to the search string, and this is not meant as a personal commentary by me on any political figure, but we'll find sites advancing the argument that Donald Trump's ego is fragile and needy, but also immense and raging. His allure is based on his appeal to our collective id, that is, our desire to be free of the strictures of law and morality and allowed to grab whatever we please. Now, Barack Obama, on the other hand, in this example, occupies the position of benign superego, incorruptible, cautious, and given to moralizing, the embodiment of our highest ideas and values, but in the end, limiting and just not very much fun. Now, Mitchell reminds us that no one is born with an ego. And being born without any sense of ego means that at first there is no I, no me, no mine. Gradually, as we grow and interact with the world, we begin developing a sense of self while working through several stages of ego development. I'm having much fun watching this development take place within my 15-month-old grandson. And if you get me started on that, you'll probably hear about it more than you ever wanted to. But during early childhood, the superego acts as a very restrictive parent to control the basic primitive urges produced by the id, just like in the baby as he gets into toddler and young child stage. Unless normal development is delayed or impeded, the control gradually passes from the superego to the ego until finally a stage is reached where the ego is no longer reliant on the superego for direction and has total charge of the personality. This mature ego creates his or her own moral code and relies on his or her own sense of right and wrong based on rational and objective analysis. So you can see if there's been some impediment to mature ego development, the chances of immature acting out become very high in an undeveloped ego personality. And we probably all know people who are like that, and I know I do. As our minds develop, our lives and therefore our thinking become more complex. The ego's job is to contain and direct the passions so that we have a correspondingly fully developed ego. A strong ego can tolerate stress and frustration and deal with reality without falling back to infantile defense mechanisms. The stronger our ego grows, the more sense of self we develop, and the greater our skills to handle whatever happens become. Ego development is designed to progress through several levels of growth towards full maturity. The higher levels of development are associated with greater recognition of the negative aspects of self, and there is a willingness to engage in introspection and come to terms with shadow aspects of the personality. But the problem is sometimes the ego keeps getting stronger without corresponding maturity. The higher states of ego development are very often never attained. And in that case, the dark side of our personality and the behaviors associated with it have an opportunity to flourish and act out. However, in a fully realized person, the ego has resolved and substantially let go of its inner conflicts between the id and the superego, the dark and the light. Accomplishing such a mature state of being is challenging and often threatening to the ego, thus requiring what Asha so aptly described as a lot of work. As she said, we must be willing to look deeper at the shadow and spend time in self-exploration and contemplation as a condition of self-knowledge and the attainment of a fully mature, authentic, self-directed, and inner-directed human being. Okay, so what does all this dry, long, drawn-out explanation of the ego have to do with gratefulness and gratitude? How do they connect, and can they coexist? Well, for starters, spiritual intelligence relates closely to ego development. Those individuals who reach the highest levels of ego maturity begin a radical shift from dependence on others' spiritual beliefs to a development of their own. Progressing further, these individuals still rely on their own views, but they move from self-preoccupation to also consider others' points of view and integrate them if appropriate. They tend to be more tolerant and start to consider serving others. They begin to search for universal values such as unconditional love, compassion, and justice. This stage of ego development is a form of spiritual intelligence, and it requires an ego which has integrated the id and the superego into a self-directed personality that recognizes both the light and the dark sides, the inner and outer aspects of self. Eckhart Tolle tells us the ego always has to have an identity, an I. And if we take away one image, another will take its place. The content of the image, the ego's thought form, may change, but the structure of the ego does not. It is always about self-image or sense of being, satisfying our needs and desires. So this brings us to gratefulness and gratitude and how they relate to the ego. According to Angeles Arian, we each have the ability to shift our awareness to one of grateful seeing, noticing first what is working in our lives before dwelling on our challenges and burdens, or on what we lack or desire but have not yet attained. She states that through conscious and sustained practice over a period of time, we can discover how gratefulness and all its related qualities, thankfulness, appreciation, compassion, generosity, grace, and so many other positive states can become integrated and embodied in our lives. This state of consciousness, Arian describes, is only possible when the ego has reached the highest level of integration of the id and the superego with the ego, when our sense of being has shifted from satisfying immature primal urges and to a fully mature conscious ego, whose self-image is more about universal values and serving others. In his teachings, the Indian mystic and spiritual leader commonly known as Osho makes a distinction between gratefulness and gratitude and how they interact with ego. He teaches that gratefulness simply means thankfulness, a thought that comes directly from the ego as an expression of thankfulness for the satisfaction of some known or unknown desire. We experience gratefulness because deep down we want something, directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, and it has been given to us. Some desire has been gratified, whether we asked for it or not. So we feel an inner thankfulness, and we outwardly express this thought to the person who has fulfilled the desire. When we are grateful to something or somebody, our parents, friends, the universe. Gratefulness is a measurable quantity, and our ego determines if and how grateful we feel in any particular instance. Osho sees gratitude in a totally different context. Gratitude has neither outward nor inward object. It is not an expression directed to anybody. It is not a thought that comes from a gratification of any desire, and it does not require any thought. Gratitude just is. It comes from the very source of our being. It comes, as Reverend Melanie said, when we can't know what is out there ahead of us, but we just know the universe is powered by love and that the world is good. Gratitude is the greatest experience that we can have. Gratitude not to anybody or anything in particular. Simply gratitude for our whole existence and the glorious splendor that is everywhere. This is not to say that feeling thankful and expressing gratefulness is not beneficial. Feeling grateful is transformative. Search for causes to be grateful and we will find them everywhere. Look for reasons to celebrate, and slowly gratefulness turns to gratitude. And each deeply felt gratitude transforms us. Gratitude makes us aware of the stillness, invites us to live in the present. As Brother David tells us, gratefulness is the key to a happy life that we hold in our hands. Because if we are not grateful, then no matter how much we have, we will not be happy because we will always want to have something else or something more. Mitchell tells us that the ego is only a barrier to spiritual insight when it is weak and full of mental distortions and conflict, when it envelops all the available attention, so the inner being cannot function. The weaker the ego strength, the less we will engage reality, and the more we will flee to superstition, wishing rather than acting, and to giving free rein to our worst impulses. On the other hand, a mature and fully developed ego reaches a transpersonal perspective where the old barriers no longer confine us and the old fears no longer constrict or claim us. We have determined a truth within that includes all that is, and we are no longer exclusively identified with the I self, our ego. The consistent practice of gratefulness leads to a deep state of gratitude. And in gratitude, the ego disappears altogether. We are filled with gratitude, and the demands of the ego lessen, and we turn our whole being towards the divine. So, are ego and gratitude mutually exclusive? My answer is no. I've learned that ego and gratitude are mutually enhancing, one preparing the way for the other. On the spiritual path to enlightenment, my ego can point me in the right direction through conscious, life-affirming choices and expressions of gratefulness for just about everything. And as gratitude grows, ego diminishes and grace fills up the space where it was. Gratefulness is a thought, an outward expression of a mature ego. Gratitude is a state of being in which we see and feel spirit moving both within and without. Gratitude opens us to freedom, a sense of generosity, and connection to the wider world. It is the awareness that we stand on holy ground. With gratitude, our whole being becomes a thanksgiving, prayer, because nothing is missing and the world is perfect and everything in it is as it should be. Thank you. I appreciate you, and I am grateful for the opportunity to be with you today.